A plane can survive the loss of one engine, even two if the pilot knows their plane. But what happens when both engines are asked for power and they just don't deliver? In January 2008, one of the safest jets in the sky lost its engines while descending into the busiest airport in Europe, a jet carrying 152 souls, gliding silently toward disaster. Something unseen had been building for hours, hidden deep within the aircraft's systems, waiting for the moment it would matter most. What happens when a machine built to withstand anything is undone by something you can't even see? This is the story of British Airways 38. The journey began in the deep winter skies over northern Asia. From Beijing, British Airways Flight 38 traced its path across the vast, empty stretches of Mongolia and Siberia, following the Great Circle route that linked east and west. Out the windows, there was nothing but endless white, frozen rivers, forests locked in ice, and clouds that glowed under a pale sun. For hours, the Boeing 777 cruised at altitudes near 40,000 feet. Outside air temperature, minus 70 degrees Celsius. In aviation, cold is more than discomfort. It's a silent adversary. Metal shrinks, hydraulics thicken, and in the fuel tanks, conditions change in ways passengers never see. Jet A1 fuel can withstand remarkable cold before freezing, about minus 57 degrees, but the temperature inside the tanks on this flight dropped to minus 34, well above the freezing point, so everything seemed fine. The gauges gave no warnings. Yet beneath the numbers, something subtle was happening. Trace amounts of water, always present in jet fuel, had begun to crystallize, not in clumps big enough to block the flow. Not yet. Instead, they formed tiny particles, ice dust, that clung to the inner walls of the pipes that ran under the wings and through the pylons. Each minute of flight across Siberia let this invisible layer build, molecule by molecule, with no hint to the crew. The lighter passenger load that day meant the aircraft required less thrust. Less thrust meant less fuel flow. And in the world of engines, low flow is dangerous. It allows more time for ice to attach and build in the plumbing. Hour after hour, the very efficiency of the Boeing 777 made the danger worse. The aircraft pressed on across Scandinavia, edging closer to London. To every passenger, it felt routine. The hum of the engines, the glow of cabin lights, a steady descent into a new day. But in the hidden veins of the machine, conditions were aligning for an unprecedented failure, a problem no one on board, or in the industry, had ever been trained to expect. And by the time the plane reached Britain, that problem was ready to surface. At the heart of this story are three pilots. Captain Peter Burkle, age 43, sat in command. He was no novice, over 12,000 hours in the air, with nearly 8,500 on the Boeing 777 alone. To his right, Senior First Officer John Coward, who carried 9,000 total hours, 7,000 of them in this very aircraft type. And alongside them, First Officer Connor McGinnis, with 5,000 hours logged, 1,120 of them in the 777. In aviation, numbers like these matter. They show depth, experience, confidence in the machine. If anything went wrong, this was the crew you'd want at the controls. And that machine, the Boeing 777, was itself a symbol of reliability. Entering service in 1995, it had built a reputation as the safest wide-body in the skies. Until that winter morning, it had never suffered a single hull loss. Each of its two Rolls-Royce Trent 800 engines weighed more than 6 tons and generated up to 93,000 pounds of thrust. The design emphasized redundancy, dual systems, backup hydraulics, multiple computers, a twin-engine airliner certified to cross oceans because regulators believed it could withstand almost anything. Lose one engine, the other carries you home. Lose both, and procedures still exist to glide safely to a runway. In theory, Burkle, Coward, and McGinnis had rotated duties during the long haul, resting in shifts, but all were back in the cockpit for the descent into Heathrow. Coward was flying, with Burkle monitoring. To them, it was another standard arrival. To the passengers, it was invisible. Captains checking speeds, first officers trimming descent profiles, autopilot tracking the glide slope. Nothing in the manuals had prepared them for what was coming. They knew the 777 systems inside out, but when the failure revealed itself, it wouldn't be a familiar emergency. It wouldn't be an engine fire, a stall, or a hydraulic failure. It would be something no simulator had ever shown them. An invisible force, now firmly embedded in the fuel system, was waiting. And when the moment arrived to call for power, those mighty engines would simply refuse. Jet fuel is never perfectly clean. Even the highest quality Jet A1 carries a trace of water, so little that it usually doesn't matter. In liquid form, it passes harmlessly through the system. But in the brutal cold over Siberia, those droplets hardened into microscopic crystals. Think of frost building up inside a freezer. Each grain is harmless. But as the hours pass, the frost thickens, spreading into a layer. Inside Flight 38's wings, the cold seeped into pipes carrying fuel toward the engines. And because the aircraft was light, the engines spent most of the trip at low thrust. Low thrust meant low fuel flow, fuel trickling through instead of rushing. That trickle gave crystals time to cling to the inner walls of the pipes, forming a lining that nobody could see, hear, or measure. The flight profile itself made matters worse. Step climbs done through the autopilot's vertical speed mode were gentle, quiet, and comfortable for passengers. But for the engines, that mode demanded less power than a steeper VNAV climb. Less power again meant slower fuel flow. Each operational choice, normal, safe, routine, was feeding the buildup. Hours passed. Over Mongolia, Russia, Scandinavia, the system carried on as designed. To the crew, everything looked perfect. Smooth ride, normal readings, fuel temperature still a safe 23 degrees above freezing. No warnings, no hint of trouble. But in reality, the stage was being set. A slow-motion threat, taking shape molecule by molecule. Not ice clogging the lines yet, but ice biding its time. Danger would remain hidden until the very end of the flight. Only when more power was demanded, more fuel needed, would that invisible lining finally give way. And by then, the jet would be minutes from landing. London lay under winter skies as Flight 38 began its descent. After 10 hours in the air, passengers fastened seatbelts and cabin crew prepared the cabin. In the cockpit, the approach briefing was complete. Runway 27L at Heathrow, one of the busiest pieces of pavement in the world, was waiting. At 800 feet, Senior First Officer John Coward was at the controls. He disconnected the autopilot, guiding the wide body by hand. Everything looked normal. Glide slope steady, speed under control, runway in sight. Then the aircraft asked for thrust. The auto throttle system, sensing a dip below the glide path, commanded more power. The right engine responded, then faltered. Its thrust rolled back to near idle. 7 seconds later, the left engine did the same. For a pilot, this was the nightmare no simulator ever taught. Both engines alive, but refusing to deliver power. Instruments showed them running, but at levels far too low to keep the jet flying the approach. Airspeed bled away. Warnings lit up. At 200 feet, the Boeing 777 was crawling at just 108 knots, well below a safe margin. The stick shaker triggered, rattling the controls in Coward's hands, signaling an imminent stall. On the ground below, Heathrow's perimeter roads, houses and traffic sat directly in the jet's path. A descent planned to end on the runway was now collapsing short. The world's safest wide-body had become a powerless glider, hundreds of feet above London, with seconds to live. And in the cockpit, 3 pilots had to decide: fight drag, fight speed, fight physics itself, just long enough to reach the airport boundary. In those final moments, the cockpit became a battlefield of instinct and experience. Senior First Officer John Coward, flying the approach, saw the thrust levers stagger, his right hand pushed them forward, but the engines refused to answer. The gauges confirmed the horror. Both turbines were running, but barely above idle. No surge, no roar, just a weak hum as the airspeed bled away. Captain Peter Burkle, monitoring, recognized the danger instantly. The jet was dropping below profile, its nose high, drag rising. In a move that went against every textbook landing, he ordered the flaps retracted from 30 degrees back to 25. It was a gamble. Flaps at 30 gave the jet lift, but they also created drag. Drag the dying engines couldn't fight. That single adjustment trimmed just enough resistance to stretch the glide. It bought them a few hundred more meters. In aviation terms, that can be the difference between crashing onto houses or touching ground inside airport fences. The stick shaker rattled violently. It's a warning every pilot dreads. The aircraft is seconds from stalling. Instinct screamed to pull back, but Coward did the opposite. He pushed the nose down, lowering pitch to keep airflow over the wings. In that decision lived the difference between a survivable crash and a total loss of control. Around them, alarms blared. In the cabin, passengers felt the silence. No thrust, no acceleration, just a jet floating unnaturally, dropping toward London's suburbs. 3 men in the cockpit, none with a checklist to fall back on. Training had never prepared them for dual-engine rollback at this stage. All they had was judgment, split-second reflexes, and the knowledge that hundreds of lives rested on their calls. Every action stretched seconds into survival, but gravity was winning. The airport boundary rushed closer, and beyond it, the ground waited. At 200 feet, the Boeing 777 was barely flying. Airspeed 108 knots, sinking rapidly. The glide path gone. Ahead lay the A30 road, crowded with midday traffic, and beyond it, the airport's southern perimeter. If the jet fell short, its 160-ton body would carve into houses and cars before it ever reached Heathrow. The crew knew this without saying it. Survival meant one thing only: keep the aircraft inside the fence. Coward leveled the wings, squeezing every ounce of lift. Burkle focused on obstacles ahead. With drag trimmed and pitch balanced, the aircraft just cleared the A30, just skimmed over the perimeter road. But it was bleeding altitude at a terrifying rate. Impact came 330 meters short of the runway. The nose gear tore away instantly. The right main landing gear punched up through the cabin floor, ripping into seat 30K. Inside, passengers felt a violent jolt, metal groaning, overhead bins bursting open, luggage scattering. The undercarriage collapsed, but in doing so, it saved them. It absorbed massive impact forces, preventing the wings from rupturing and igniting fuel. The fuselage scraped along the grass, sliding to a shuddering halt in a cloud of dirt and smoke. When the Boeing 777 slammed into the grass short of runway 27L, the violence inside the cabin was immediate. Passengers were thrown forward, trays and luggage bursting free, overhead bins cracking open like shells. The fuselage shuddered as the landing gear ripped away, the right main gear spearing up through the floor and into the passenger cabin. Seat 30K absorbed the worst of it. One passenger was crushed, becoming the accident's sole serious injury. Others nearby suffered cuts, bruises, broken bones. For dozens more, the trauma was invisible. Shock, disorientation, the sudden realization that the smooth descent had ended in chaos. But amid the wreckage, a critical miracle: no fire. The collapsing gear, by design, had absorbed the impact energy, sparing the wings and fuel tanks from rupturing violently. Fuel did leak, but it didn't ignite. That single factor gave everyone on board a chance to live. The crew wasted no time. Within seconds, evacuation was underway. Cabin crew yanked open exits, inflated slides, and pushed passengers out into the freezing January air. Training took over, voices cutting through fear, commands to leave everything behind, to run clear. Despite shock, the evacuation was fast. All 136 passengers, plus 16 crew, cleared the wreckage in under 90 seconds. The benchmark regulators set as the maximum allowable evacuation time. Families scrambled together on the grass. Some passengers hobbled away with minor injuries. Others, barefoot in the cold, simply collapsed onto the field, unable to process that they were alive. Out of 152 souls on board, 47 were injured, one seriously. Not a single life lost. From the outside, the jet lay crippled, engines broken, landing gear twisted, its nose down, tail high, wings sagging, and its frame scarred into history as the first hull loss of the Boeing 777. It looked like the aftermath of a disaster, and yet against all odds, everyone was still breathing. For Heathrow, the busiest hub in Europe, it was a near miss of unthinkable proportions. And for investigators, it was the beginning of a mystery, because nothing in the wreckage pointed to a simple mechanical fault. The real culprit lay deeper, in a place no one expected. The Air Accidents Investigation Branch, Britain's AAIB, faced a puzzle unlike any it had seen before. Engines that hadn't failed, but hadn't delivered. No bird strike, no fuel exhaustion, no fire. Just a modern wide-body rolling back its own thrust at the worst possible moment. Investigators pulled apart the fuel system piece by piece. They traced the flow from tanks in the wings to pumps, filters, and finally, the heart of the engine, the fuel oil heat exchanger, or FOHE. This component was designed to be a safeguard, warming cold fuel with hot engine oil, ensuring it wouldn't freeze downstream. But here was the paradox: the safety device itself had become the failure point. During the descent, as the auto throttle commanded more power, warm fuel surged forward and loosened the ice crystals that had been quietly building along the pipes. That slush of softened ice swept into the FOHE and the exchanger's design, Dense, fine tubes with narrow inlets made it fatally vulnerable. The slurry clogged both engines FOHES at once, starving them of fuel at the precise moment they needed more. It was a textbook black swan failure. The system built to prevent icing had never been tested against this exact scenario. Certification standards hadn't accounted for it. On paper, the engines were safe. In practice, they had been seconds from catastrophe. For comparison, other famous ice accidents had been very different. Scandinavian Airlines Flight 751 in 1991, or Air Ontario Flight 1363 in 1989. Those involved ice on the wings, chunks breaking loose and being sucked into engines. The response was new ground procedures, better de-icing, stricter pilot awareness. But BA-38 was different. The ice was internal, invisible, and undetectable in flight. The revelation shook confidence in what regulators thought they knew. If a hidden flaw could exist inside one of the safest engines on one of the safest aircraft, what else was lurking in the blind spots? The answer demanded more than training. It demanded redesign. In the days after the crash, headlines hailed the crew as heroes. British Airways CEO Willie Walsh praised their extraordinary professionalism. Within weeks, all 16 crew members were awarded the airline's highest honor, the Safety Medal. For passengers who walked away from the wreck, their skill had been the margin between survival and tragedy. But recognition came with weight. For Captain Peter Burkle, the memory of those final seconds never faded. He spoke later of being haunted by the event, replaying every decision in his mind. Despite his actions saving hundreds, the psychological strain was severe. He and Senior First Officer John Coward were grounded for weeks while undergoing assessment for post-traumatic stress. Burkle eventually took voluntary redundancy. He later wrote 30 Seconds to Impact, a book that revealed not just the cockpit drama, but also his disillusionment with how the airline handled the aftermath. He felt isolated, unsupported, left to carry both public praise and private trauma. Only years later did he return to the cockpit, resuming the career that had defined his life. The contrast is stark. To the world, Flight 38 was a triumph of airmanship. To those who lived it, it was a brush with death that left invisible scars. Trauma doesn't vanish when the fuselage is cleared from the grass. It lingers, in flashbacks, in restless nights, in the uneasy silence of knowing how close disaster came. The passengers carried their own scars too. Gratitude mixed with fear. For many, the memory of sliding down evacuation chutes onto frozen ground was impossible to separate from the thought, what if the tanks had ignited? This is the part of aviation history often overlooked. Technical answers matter, but so do the human costs, the quiet reckonings that follow survival. Flight 38 was not only an engineering failure, it was a reminder of what crews carry long after the applause fades. The AAIB's final report issued a clear mandate: redesign the fuel oil heat exchanger. Rolls-Royce engineers went back to the drawing board, altering the geometry that had trapped ice. The new design removed the fine crimps and made the fuel tubes flush with the plate, allowing slush to pass through without clogging. Boeing issued its own service bulletins, ensuring the changes were rolled out fleet-wide. Regulators moved quickly. By July 2009, the European Aviation Safety Agency issued an airworthiness directive, mandating replacement of every vulnerable FOHE on Rolls-Royce Trent 800 engines. The FAA followed suit. By the end of the year, the flaw that nearly destroyed Flight 38 was engineered out of existence. But the legacy went deeper than metal. It was a reminder that no system is beyond scrutiny. Aviation's culture of safety depends on hunting the rare, the unthinkable, the scenarios hidden in blind spots. Certification rules were re-examined. Simulator training incorporated scenarios where both engines failed to respond. The lesson was simple: even a black swan must be prepared for once it's seen. For the Boeing 777, the incident marked its first hull loss, but the type's reputation endured. In fact, the survival of all 152 people reinforced its structural resilience, its system's integrity, even under failure. The aircraft that should have been a tomb became instead a case study in survivability. And so the story of Flight 38 is both caution and reassurance. Caution because it proved that invisible forces, microscopic crystals, could bring down giants. Reassurance because even in that failure, multiple safety nets caught, an experienced crew, a strong airframe, and a culture of investigation that refuses to let mystery stand. Safety in aviation isn't an endpoint, it's a living process, carved out of mistakes, refined through tragedy narrowly avoided. The passengers of Flight 38 walked away because the system bent but didn't break. The world flies safer today because their near-disaster forced change. That's the chain of events behind an invisible force that almost killed 152 people. Incidents like these don't just fade into history, they reshape the systems we trust daily. Each lesson carved from near disaster is why flying remains the safest way to travel. If you want to keep uncovering how aviation learns from its narrowest escapes, subscribe, like, and share to bring more people into this conversation about why we still trust the skies.